The first order of business in this mini series is going to be removal of the bottom bracket. And this is important because when these come from the factory, they're usually way too tight and they usually don't have very much grease inside them. The problem with that is between the tightness and the lack of grease, they're going to wear out fast and leave you with tons of issues when it comes to pedaling. So what I suggest is removal of the bottom bracket and then really load these things up with grease, and then you can go back through and reinstall them knowing that it's going to be lubricated and set properly. Okay, so the first thing that you're going to need to do before you can actually remove the bottom bracket is you're going to need to take your crank arms off. Now, when you receive the bike, it's going to have two crank arms. It's going to have a drive side crank arm that has the sprocket as part of the crank arm, and then it's going to have the other side, which is just an arm. Now, one of the things you need to know is that these have a square tapered hole, and this actually fits onto the spindle that runs through the bottom bracket and connects the two crank arms together. When you receive it, it'll actually have a 15mm bolt holding it on. Now mine's changed a little bit because I've put new crank arms on it, but what you're going to need is you're going to need a socket wrench with a 15mm socket, and you're going to need to take those bolts out. Now, when you remove the bolts, the crank arms will not come off, and in fact, they are going to be on there very tight. Really, the only good way to remove them is to use a crank puller. Now, this is a maybe a slightly higher end crank puller, but you can get them as just a small piece. And what happens is this outer collar threads into a cut thread inside the crank arm, and then basically you just spin it, and it's going to push the crank arm off. And I'll demonstrate that for you on the bike. The very first thing you're going to need to do is you're going to need to remove the chain from the sprocket up here, and you can simply just kind of pull on it and bring it in towards the frame, and then your crank arm should be loose. Now, once you've got the chain off, it's a matter of actually taking those bolts out. So on yours, you would use that 15mm and take these loose. Now, on mine, I've actually got an Allen. So it's a 10mm Allen, and basically it just goes in there, you loosen it, and out comes the bolt. Now, what you'll notice though is that this crank arm is still on there super tight. It's not coming off without that special tool. So what we're going to do is we're going to use our crank puller. And what you want to do is take that outer collar, and you just want to thread it down until it's flush with the end of the other piece. And then you're going to take it and you're going to put it in there, and you're simply going to thread it into the threads that are cut into the crank arm. Now, once it bottoms out, you're actually going to want to go a little bit tighter. What I found is majority of these use a 7/8 wrench. However, if you don't have that, an adjustable wrench will work just fine. What you do is you run this in, until it's completely tight, and then all you need to do is hold the opposing crank arm and run this tool down. And what this is going to do is it's going to pull the crank arm off of that spindle. So it just bottomed out. Now you can kind of work with the other arm, and it'll loosen up pretty easily, and then voila, pops out. And we'll do the same thing for the other side. The next step in the process is to actually remove your bottom bracket cups. Now that's this piece here, and you've got a matching piece on the other side, but it's got a bunch of slots cut in it. Now to pull this side, all you're going to need is your adjustable wrench, and basically you're just going to take it, and now just so you know, on the drive side it's going to be reverse thread, so you're going to want to go forward instead of backwards when you crank this thing off. So once we get it on there, and that came loose pretty easily. Now once this comes off, your spindle will actually be free on the inside, and you'll also have a bearing in there, and it should be very heavily greased. If it's not, it needs to be. So you can pull that bearing out, set it aside, and then you can actually pull your spindle through. Now mine's got this little sleeve on it, and basically it just keeps from moisture from dropping down the seat tube into the bottom bracket from causing issues. However, yours may not have that, especially if yours is just a new Mongoose. We've got the bike spun around, and now you can see the other side of the bottom bracket cup. Now this actually has this adjustable collar on it, and then it's got a threaded center section. They do actually make a special tool. It's a spanner that fits into these little notches cut into this for removal. Now I don't have one because this is actually a really old style bottom bracket, so it's not in my tool set because my tool set's a little newer. So what I've always just done is used a screwdriver and a rubber mallet. Now I'm sure I'll get some flack for this, but it's the simplest and easiest way, and I've been doing this for a long time and never really had any issues. And basically you just tap it until that comes loose, and then you pull that threaded piece off, and then the cup itself will thread right out of the bottom bracket on the frame. Once that's removed, you'll also see there is a set of bearings in there that should be very heavily greased. If they are not, they need to be. And this is the most important thing when you buy a new Mongoose, is to make sure these things are loaded up with grease, because they come sometimes almost dry. Okay, there you've got it. That was the removal of the bottom bracket. Super easy, only takes about 5-10 minutes. If you've never done it, maybe 20. Now when you get this thing apart, this is kind of what you're going to see. So you'll have that first piece with the two flats that we removed with the adjustable wrench. This is your bearing that sits inside of here. You've got your spindle, your next bearing, you've got the other side, your cup, and then you've got the slotted collar that threads down on the cup. Now, before you go back together, you're going to want to grease the heck out of this thing. And I grease every single surface. I load these cups up with grease. I grease the entire spindle. I grease everything. And I use a bicycle-specific grease made by Dualco, and it works actually very well to lubricate everything. It does a great job. When you go back together, make sure that you put this piece on first. This is the piece that you need to install with the adjustable wrench, and tighten it down until it's snug. Then you can put your bearing onto your spindle. I'll kind of demonstrate. So you put your bearing onto your spindle. Make sure that the cage is facing away from the race on the spindle. Then you'll put it through your bottom bracket, and it'll sit inside here. Then you can put your other bearing in onto the spindle. Same thing, make sure that the cage is facing away from the race. Then what you'll do is you'll install this. You're going to thread this into the bottom bracket until it touches, and then you're going to take this collar and you're going to thread it on there, and you're going to run that down until it hits the bottom bracket on the actual frame itself. And then what I do is I just kind of spin it a couple times to make sure it's not too tight, and I make my adjustments as necessary. So sometimes you might have to take this off, tighten this in even a little bit further, and then tighten this down even more. Alright, quick and easy. So that was the first episode in this Mongoose Mini Series that I'll be doing. Now make sure you go ahead and hit that subscribe button, because I'm going to be coming to you with a lot more on this bike. How to grease your hubs, how to disassemble the headset and remove it, and I'm even going to make a makeshift paint booth for this thing, and I'll show you guys how to do it in your garage. So subscribe, give it a thumbs up, and if you have any comments or suggestions, throw them down below. Thanks again, you guys.